Hello, and thank you for joining the World Federation of Youth Clubs for our October webcast, Raising Funds in Developing Nations. We're so glad that you could join us today to learn from some truly expert fundraisers and nonprofit professionals from different corners of the globe who are here to share their stories and experiences and advice for fellow fundraisers. Before we get started, a few pieces of business. First, our agenda for today, we'll start with a little bit of housekeeping and how to listen to this session in Spanish. We'll go through some introductions of our panelists, and then we'll move immediately into what you came here for, our panel discussion featuring our three fundraisers. After that, we'll have a little bit of time for questions. So if you are listening to this session today and there's something that you would like to know more about, please use the Q&A function or the chat at the bottom of your screen. We'll close out with next steps and contact information. And if you registered for this event, you will receive an email with a link to the recording in the next couple of days. So before we get started, this session is being recorded, and live transcription in English will be enabled. If you prefer to listen to this session in Spanish, you can do so by selecting the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and selecting Spanish. This is a Zoom webinar. It's not a Zoom meeting. So the only faces that you'll see on the screen today are from WFYC staff members like myself, who I did not introduce. My name is Abby LeMay. I'm the Vice President of Impact at World Federation of Youth Clubs, and our panelists who will introduce themselves here in just a moment. All attendees and participants are muted. So if you have a question, please use the chat, raise your hand, or use the Q&A function. And there are many ways to tune in to this session today on Zoom, but the best view happens if you click View, then Speaker View, or side-by-side Speaker View. So you can see the speakers and the presentation slides at the same time. And now I am thrilled to introduce you to Mike McTernan, who is the CEO of Boys and Girls Club of South Africa, as well as a World Federation of Youth Clubs Mission Advancement Advisor. Mike will serve as our moderator today. If you joined us last month, you might recognize him. He was our moderator for our panel last month. And today's discussion is going to take a deeper dive into those fundraising strategies that our audience had more questions about. So, Mike, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this month's webinar. Excited to be here talking with some interesting people. A little bit about myself. So as the slide says, I'm Mike McTernan, Boys and Girls Clubs of South Africa CEO, currently based in Johannesburg, and also doing some support work for the World Federation in Southern Africa as well. I've been involved in fundraising in developing markets or developing nations since 2004, when I spent a little bit of time in Mexico when I was working for the environmental organization Greenpeace, and started to explore the ins and outs of raising funds in developing nations, which often have a lot more complexity and different challenges than what people may have in a Western or a European or a North American economy. So it's an honor to be here, and I would like to pass you over to Reverend Jonathan Weaver to tell us a bit about himself.
Thank you very much, and greetings to everyone. My pleasure to be a part of this webinar today. My involvement in terms of development work, fundraising, really started in 1971, 52 years ago, when I served as a volunteer helping to build a health clinic just on the outskirts of Lagos, Nigeria. So I had to raise the princely sum of $1,500 to cover my expenses in order to make that trip. But since that time, I've become the founder and president of an organization called the Pan-African Collective, where we have a presence in Malawi, Haiti, Rwanda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so what we're doing there is really engaged in an early childhood development center in Rwanda, as well as helping vulnerable families as a result of the genocide that took place in 1994. There's also a school that bears my name in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a primary and secondary school. But I'm also just recently not retired as a pastor, but I'm now what is called a presiding elder within the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And we have a presence in 35 countries in Africa. So I've been spending time over the years also trying to provide support for those churches, many of which need some support. And I've been happily doing that as well. So I'm delighted to be a part of this webinar for today.
Thank you, Reverend. And I think we'll pass it over to Di to tell us a bit about herself.
Thanks, everyone. Very difficult to follow Reverend Weaver after that introduction. Certainly starting to feel like I might be just a fledgling in the fundraising sector, especially with your CV, Reverend. But my name is Dianne. I'm currently the head of new business development for Save the Children South Africa, which is the local chapter of a global child rights movement. I have been in fundraising. I have about 10 years in total experience in fundraising. I actually started my career at Greenpeace Africa under Mike, interestingly enough, all those years ago, and really started to learn my passion and interest for fundraising, and how I see it really is just working with people to achieve likely goals. I've worked at Greenpeace, and I currently work at Save the Children, and I've really, something that really interests me about fundraising is just how much the sector has changed and grown over the years in terms of how we fundraise, how we tell our stories, how we call our donors partners instead of donors these days as well. And so that's always something that I'm interested in passing on. So thank you. Over to you, Mike.
Great, good stuff. Nice to hear a bit about you guys. So I'm going to start with the questions and the conversation. Hopefully this is more of a conversation between the three of us, so we can share our ideas. I think when it comes to organizations or people, just starting out, the first question often is, how do you build a network? How do you find people of the like-minded to themselves that maybe have some funding available or some ability to support available? And I think I'd like to pass this one over firstly to the Reverend to tell us a little bit about how did you get in front of that first group of people to give you $1,500, Reverend, back in the day? How do you go about this crazy thing of finding people to give us money?
Well, I think it starts with, is there a connection that you feel in terms of this involvement? I had never been to Africa before between my junior and senior years at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, but I was captivated by a photo album from someone who had just returned from Africa, participating as a volunteer with this organization called Operation Crossroads Africa. I don't consider it to be happenstance or by accident, but she looked at me as I was getting so excited, and she simply said to me, "Well, Jonathan, you ought to go." And as a result of that, that's exactly what I did. I've really developed a serious passion for Africa and its people. And at that juncture, knowing that I had to raise that $1,500 to cover all of my expenses, I went to churches, I went to local newspapers, I went to previous employers where I had summer jobs, and just people that I knew back in my hometown of Rockville, Maryland. And most of the people said, "Jonathan, my gosh, you're really excited about this." And I do think that when it comes to fundraising, there has to be that kind of excitement, passion that a person shows. And it worked for me for that first $1,500. And I did make the commitment, and I think this is important as well, meaning accountability. So I made a commitment to say to the folks that gave me support that I would come back to their organization and give them a report about what took place. So that's really how it got launched for me, if you will.
Yeah, great. I think one of the kind of overarching themes there is about talking to people and getting relationships and building relationships with people. It's easy for us to often sit behind our laptops and send emails and a correspondence of that sort without actually having proper conversations with people. So I also agree that meeting someone face to face and talking to people, finding opportunities to share our passion is a great way to build a network of support for your organization. Di, what would you say is a couple of big key tips that you would like to share around building that network?
Thanks, Mike. Just to kind of follow on from what Reverend Weaver said, it's the passion and excitement for what it is that you're seeking funding for. So, I think it is a person-to-person engagement. This isn't, you said it yourself, it's quite easy to sit behind a computer and send emails and kind of these mass appeals. But really, when you start to, if you're passionate about something and you're engaging someone about that, they're likely to feel it as well. And it really tells a little bit more of a story and really engages them, not just with their head, but with the heart. And I think that is what has come out so clearly in your story, Reverend, about you wanted to go and experience this so much that, for sure, when you were talking to your old bosses or your church, that they really felt that, and they felt compelled to give, to support you, to go to that. So I think that's really important. And also it's reaching out and speaking to people within your networks. And I think sometimes that first conversation might be quite hard because you're thinking, oh, well, I'm about to ask for money for something, or I'm about to put them in a position where they have to think about something and say yes or no. But actually, it's surprisingly easy, if it's just a conversation, and it really is putting a proposition on the table for them to pick up. So I think that that's something from your personal story that really shone out for me. So when I first got into fundraising as well, it was an incredibly scary thing. I remember sitting behind my desk a lot, typing out some kinds of proposals that never went anywhere, but I was just trying to maybe get a little bit used to it. But as time goes on, I think the more you read, the more you practice, the better you get at it, and the more confident you become in speaking to other people. So if I could give anyone advice, it's really that it's just step outside from time to time. I actually have a story about that. I had a boss very early on in my career, one of my bosses, who would take me to these big networking events and then walk me up to a group of people and say, "Hi, everybody, do you know Dianne?" And then she'd disappear. And it was really, at the time, really cruel. And I felt so embarrassed by it. But thanks to her encouragement of just saying, speak, go out and speak and get to know people, I was able to do that a lot better. So I think if there's any kind of advice I'd give individuals who want to get into the fundraising world and for whatever reason, is just to take that first leap, whether it's an email, a phone call, or going out to an event to speak.
Yeah, great. I think events and those kind of bigger public forums and group settings are also a great way to get to the actual people that maybe will be decision makers or able to influence decision makers as well. So I really encourage everyone, if you have a local, US Chamber of Commerce or British Chamber of Commerce or something in your country, see if you can connect there and see if there's any activities. They're not always very active, but those kind of events are really a great way to get in front of people who are there to make business, to make things happen. And you just might be at the right place at the right time with someone who says, you know what, we should be supporting this kind of work in the country where we're doing business. Reverend, I'm quite interested, and I know a lot of the panelists will be interested in your experience around working with communities of faith, diaspora groups, and those kind of networks where people can connect. I'm wondering if you could maybe share a couple of best practices or some personal experience around working with faith-based groups. Is diaspora really a thing? Are there, thousands of Rwandans waiting to give money to Rwanda in Baltimore, for example? If you could share some thoughts on that, that would be great.
Sure. And I think that especially when we've been talking about fundraising in a developing country. So one of the things that I've continued to do over the years is when I travel to nations in Africa is to make it a point of listening so that I can get a better sense of the needs, the concerns, the challenges that they're facing there in that given country, so that when I return to the United States, because of them sharing with me, I'm able to tell their story more clearly and distinctly. And therefore, people in the United States, particularly those that are connected to my particular denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. However, what I have found over the years is that our support has not been limited to members of the AME Church, largely because I've always been thinking ecumenically. So I've got friends within the Baptist faith, Church of God in Christ, who have been supportive of the work, not because I'm AME, but it's because they know me, we've connected at other meetings and settings. That's number one. The other thing that I have found is that there are service groups such as the Lions Club, Rotary Club, that are worldwide. And interestingly enough, we have pastors and leaders in Rwanda and Congo that are a part of the Rotary Club. And so I've been able to therefore connect with officials of Rotary clubs here in the United States that has helped to generate support for what we're doing. Lastly, what I've also done is to make sure that members of the diplomatic community from the United States, for example, are made aware. And I've done that sort of in an unusual way. For example, here in the state of Maryland, both of our United States senators are aware of what we're doing there in Congo and in Rwanda. And I've always communicated that information to our friends that represent our work in Rwanda and Congo. So case in point, there in Congo where the school is located, we actually were able to have the U.S. ambassador from, the U.S. ambassador to the DRC to visit the school. And subsequently, he went on to another assignment, but then when there were confirmation hearings for the next ambassador to the DRC, one of the United States senators from Maryland said to her, listen, I have a dear friend in Prince George's County, Maryland, who has a school there in Congo. And I'm asking you now, if you get confirmed, will you promise to go and visit the school? That's a part of the congressional record that she said, by all means. And I'm going to DRC just in a couple of weeks. She hasn't been there yet, but I've now got an appointment to visit with her at the embassy. So the whole point of that is every ambassador around the world has community development support money available. And so my hope and my intent is to be able to share with her not only the importance of being able to visit the school, but then let us know how there may be some ways in which even out of your office, you're able to support this work.
Yes, no, I think that's a great example as well, Reverend, around the importance of having sustainable relationships as well. And the willingness of people that you've got support with or you've worked with in the past to refer you and to be your advocate, because that's often a challenge for us. No one knows who we are. We know we're doing great stuff. Having those champions and those people that say, I worked with these guys before, trust me, you can bank on them. They're doing great work. Why don't you take a look? Is like a super, super valuable networking tool and way to open doors and get referrals through your background. So I think everyone who's listening, don't burn your bridges. Make sure that you keep people on side. If you make your promises, follow through, stay in touch with people. People love to hear, hey, by the way, that we're doing this, or we're going to try and do this, and wanted to update you with these photos. And then people really see the work on the ground, and it's not just some mystery place they gave some money to and walk away from. Di, I know that when you were with SAY, when we were in contact a few years ago, you were doing stuff with the Danish embassy and maybe some of the other embassies in Pretoria, north of Johannesburg. I'm wondering if you can maybe talk a little bit about, those kind of communities that you've worked with in the past, and give any thoughts on dealing with diplomats.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really does speak again to relationship building. So, and just thinking about people who have designated interest in the region in which you're working. So that for us would be the diplomatic community that's based here in South Africa, in Pretoria, but have interest as well in, for example, they might be in Swaziland, Malawi, Zambia. So we started working with the embassy, the Royal Danish Embassy of Denmark, a few years ago in 2018. We had formed a relationship with the then ambassador who had changed. I think she had left 2 months after we'd formed the relationship, but was very happy to introduce us to the incoming ambassador, who we then had a wonderful relationship for going on 5 years now, because they loved South Africa so much that they requested to extend their stay in the country. They've only just left, I think it was in June or July this year. They ended up funding one of our programs, but also, and I think it was important to get that funding for a piece of program that it was very difficult to sell this to a corporate, for example. It was really around child rights, accountability, and something that I think the diplomatic community really understood from a legal or a governance perspective. And that was wonderful, and we really did appreciate it. But more to what they really did to support us was they started to include us more in their circles. So when they would have an ambassadors evening with other ambassadors, and I mean, this is kind of an open network with 10 or 15 ambassadors from, the Swiss ambassador, the Japanese ambassador, the Korean ambassador. We would be invited to their events, and we'd be able to engage with this whole cohort and start making linkages. And so from that, we were able to develop a relationship with Sweden as well, with UK, with New Zealand, America, Australia. So there were really a lot of relationships that came just from being held under the wing almost of the Danish ambassador and his team. And this led also to really thinking a bit more broadly as well. How do we start to engage these communities in our work beyond fundraising, and so beyond needing money for programs? And so we started to be able to include advocacy asks and joint statements, or hosting events, breakfasts at one of their residences, because of course that has a certain appeal to it when you're reaching out to funders and you're hosting it at the Royal Danish Embassy, for example. So yeah, these relationships are incredibly important, where you can identify one, really build on them, build that trust. As Reverend Weaver said, taking the ambassador to the school, letting them really experience firsthand what it is that you're doing, ended up with a nomination or a referral much later. It's the same for us, really. You build that trust, you keep them close, and then start to think how else you can engage them in your programs, where it's not just a fundraising ask as well.
Yeah, great. I think that, the point about pitching your kind of thematic area or your area where you need to the right audience is also super important. So it's a bit about knowing what's going to land well. And I think it's different in every part of the world, obviously. But I think also it's important to say, often because we're connected to the Federation and there's a lot of American support through there, it's not just the US Embassy that we can talk to, it's all the other embassies as well. And especially, each one has a different angle. The Nordic countries are really strong on child rights. The Americans tend to be more on education. Understanding what the interest is really important when you want to have those conversations as well. Reverend, I'd be interested in your experience with taking it a bit more to the grassroots level with regards to tribal leadership, local elected officials, and that type of thing. How have you gone about connecting with those kind of funds? Often they're not, huge amounts of money, but it can be quite strategic to get a building or some money to pay for some food and whatnot. Have you done much of that before?
Yes, and again, relying quite heavily over the local officials of the African Methodist Episcopal Church there in Goma, for example. So I've met with the mayor of Goma. I've had an opportunity to talk to the governor of North Kivu, which is the province there where Goma is located, who has expressed a great deal of interest in what we're doing. I've had an opportunity, I alluded to it earlier, the head of the Rotary Club there in Goma, and likewise even across the line back in Rwanda, I've met and talked with the head of the Rotary Club there in the city of Gisenyi, which is the border town just before you get to the DRC. Terribly, terribly important. We've also had, if you will, some support coming from a privately held trust, simply because I went to a dinner where the head of state of Congo was there, but before the president came into the meeting, I introduced myself to this individual. And so when I told him what I was doing, he said, "Oh my goodness, I'm going to Goma in 3 weeks. And is there somebody there that you would like for me to see?" And I said, "Well, yes." And I guess part of what I'm suggesting, Mike, is we need to also seize sometimes those proverbial elevator conversations simply because you never know. You may only have a few moments to be able to tell the story, and you've got to be sensitive to the persons that you're talking to and the timing, because shortly after he had mentioned that I could give him contacts, the president came into the dinner. And so at least I made that contact, which resulted in $15,000 that went towards an agricultural project there in Goma. And the benefit of that came that there was young people that had been a part of rebel groups who left serving as rebels and came back home because they learned how to be able to raise money through that agricultural project for their families. And so when you're able to produce and get results, it certainly helps considerably when you're turning around and seeking more support, not only from that same organization, but certainly with that kind of good report opens the door to other possibilities as well.
Great, yes, and I like your point on the elevator pitch, and I'm going to throw it to Dianne now, because it's important to have a couple of aces up your sleeve, as they say, or you have some idea on what you want to say. Dianne, what when thinking about your baseline, if you meet Bill Gates tomorrow in the elevator, this is your one shot. What's some tips or some guidance you would give people? Because often we get sucked into the details and the technicalities. We've got a 30-minute long spiel and you don't have 30 minutes. So what would you say is a couple of tips on that one?
Also, you don't have very colorful, engaging slides, a deck of slides, right, that you can kind of go through and lean on. I think, as an anecdote, just quickly, I think, so one of the best conversations I ever had with a donor that resulted in funding was me jogging next to her as she was going to her next meeting. I literally had 2 or 3 minutes and I kind of was jogging next to her and I told her about the program and we sold it. So it was really just your top 3 messages. Try not to deviate from that. You don't need to go into this whole explanation of the history of the organization and kind of where you come from and how it got to where it is. This is what we're doing. This is why it's important. This is how you can help. Because that's all a donor sometimes really has time for, and it really is the most important information that they need to know. So, try not to, and if you feel yourself deviating and talking about the history, come back. This is why it's important. This is why we want to, what we want to do, and this is how you can help.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you also it's very rare that you're going to get in that situation and someone is going to say, look, here's $15,000 like the Reverend got from that one. But I think you should have a clear plan as well. Like if you find yourself in front of someone who you think is an opportunity to partner with you, get your spiel across, but also try and figure out what you want to do next. Can I pop you an email? Can I give you a call? Do you have a PA? How can I add you on LinkedIn? Have some kind of next step so that you don't just fade away into the distance, because a lot of these important people interact with, dozens, if not more people every single day, and it's hard to make yourself stand out just for that short period of time. But having some kind of agreement to carry on the conversation, I think is really, really important as well.
Absolutely right.
And I think when we tell our story, when we share our passion or we share our mission, verbally and that kind of thing is like really important. But also I would like to get your thoughts, Reverend, around keeping the dignity of the beneficiaries or the youth that we work with, protecting them, not telling, those horrible stories of starvation or some kind of dehumanizing element of what they do. So I'd be interested in getting both of your thoughts on how do we protect the best interests of the kids and the communities that we serve from being stigmatized or being looked down upon. Reverend, do you have any thoughts on that?
One of the very first things that comes to mind, Mike, is to be able to share with a potential donor success stories. So that in our case, yes, virtually all of our students at the school are either orphans or the children of survivors of rape. However, we already have graduates from the school that are now entrepreneurs, working full-time jobs. Some of them have actually gone on to enter into one of the universities there in Congo. And I think that really does impress people to know that impact has already been generated. And I think that's what a lot of donors are looking for, not to simply give money, thinking and hoping that something might emerge from it, But if you're able to, even in that elevator conversation, to be able to give to people the fact that there is something significant that happens as a result of their support. And to me, I'm always making it a point of stressing that. And also, one can't always get away from the numbers. I mean, so for example, when I tell people that we started with 86 students and now there's 1,268 students just 6 years later, that's a phenomenal growth. And again, people are impressed by that. But I do think that people want to know whether or not there's going to be some value given as a result of the investment that they make, and of course, accountability. And so those kinds of things I think are terribly important to people, and perhaps just make your giving, or at least your ask, far more palatable, if you will. That's what I would say.
Great. Di, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a very important topic, and something that we've in the industry have gotten wrong many, many times. And we learn, right? This isn't to say that if you get it wrong in how we're telling the story about one of our participants in our programs, one of the beneficiaries, that we that's the kind of mark against your name. And I think that the point is that you learn, you experience. Certainly coming from Save the Children, I've really learned about how it is that we tell the story of children who benefit from our programs in a way that gets the story across, still maintains the urgency of the situation. You're offering fundraising for very critical humanitarian responses, and you can tell that story, you can get the message across while maintaining the dignity of the participants, of the beneficiaries. You're using their faces, you're using their stories. This isn't just a story, it's something that someone's living in. So how do you do that while maintaining that this is a person? We've come such a far cry away from some NGOs or some of the kinds of advertising or images you used to see, maybe of a very malnourished child, flies on the face, this devastating reality. So we've moved away from that to showing the potential, right? This is what the reality on the ground, but this is the potential of the child. And I think that's really important, or the mother or the father or whoever it might be that you're fundraising for. And I think it's really critical to maintain this reflection as we grow in this sector. So maybe in 10 years' time, we'll be thinking differently again and kind of refining the way we do things. But it really is important. And I ask us to always have that self-reflection as we are working with these communities, because there is a power dynamic. And it is how we relate in that power dynamic to protect them that is really important. So I'm glad you asked the question. And I just really want to enforce that we constantly self-check.
Yeah. Great. Cool. Okay, on to a next topic. Going to talk a little bit about as we talk with partners and we talk with donors and we build these partnerships, often that comes with an obligation on us to report back and feedback on what we're doing. But I think it's also important that we don't become donor-led as our organizations. We've got our mission, we've got our vision, we've got our strategy. It's easy sometimes to get taken away on a fairy tale that doesn't achieve any of our goals at all. And I personally, a couple of years ago, we were working with a very large possible funder here in South Africa. Would be several $1 million US dollars over a period of a couple of years. But as the program kind of iterated through the different things that we were going to do, it became quite apparent to me about 4 or 5 months into the process that this was going to consume the whole of Boys and Girls Clubs of South Africa. We were no longer going to be Boys and Girls Clubs of South Africa. We're going to be a job farm for a government strategy that was completely disaligned from what we were trying to achieve. So we had to walk away from that, and it's hard when you see all those zeros and you're like, oh, but imagine what we could do with all of this money. So that's a big one, but often even on the small case as well, we might have a smaller possible partner coming through saying, I'd love to do this kind of thing. And then there's a bit of a gray area around whether or not that's really core to your mission or is going to help you achieve your goals. So Reverend, I'm curious if you've ever had that experience before, if you have any advice, if the US Embassy comes to a small nonprofit in Zambia, says $20,000, but I want you to do X, Y, Z. and the NGOs like, we've never done this before, this is completely off our strategy, what advice would you give to that organization?
Well, first of all, what we've tried to do, and it's a continuing process, is to make sure that we are empowering the local organization so that they don't end up having a sense of dependence on us here in America. Yes, my passion is to make sure that they are successful, and it's not always money, but it's also about training, developing leaders there, and specifically when it comes to the funding source. So I would say that one of the things that we've done is to at least help them knowing about, for example, corporations, and not just American corporations, but corporations in that given country, so that they can begin to understand the importance of making those contacts, letting the people know about the work, what we call in Rwanda, the Pan-African Empowerment. And that name was by design so that they would recognize how important it is to get to the point where they're not simply waiting for the next check to come from the United States, but to spend time really reaching out to the broader community, whether or not it's corporations or even quasi-relationships with other organizations, partnering, for example, with other NGOs there in Rwanda or in Goma. So I think that that's one of the things that we try to do, not to get to the point where they feel as if they no longer need us, because I do think that there's still a power in having this kind of relationship so that we can continue to learn from them and find out how we can best support them. And so that's one of the things that we've been doing now, both for our committee there in Rwanda. So we have regular sessions with our board here in the United States. And so, and part of that is in fact, training them, sharing with them, because that's not really the culture there in Rwanda for NGOs that are local as they are, or at least a chapter of ours here in the United States. So I suspect that you have to be aware of what those realities are. Now, in Rwanda, for example, the government, however, is expecting NGOs to make sure that they produce. And so our organization there in Rwanda, for example, we have been able to provide them financially support for their projects, but they also know the importance of communicating with corporations and other organizations that might be able to give them support. And likewise, even our friends, even though we don't have a chapter of the Pan-African Collective yet in Congo, but we're close to that, but they have fully understood the importance of reaching out into the broader community as well.
Yeah, great. Di, I'm going to take it a little bit on a tangent here, because it's bringing us to a later question. I'll bring it up now. I'd like your opinion or your thoughts on this, specifically with regards to Save the Children. You know, smaller national or grassroots organizations, often we look up and we see Save the Children or Plan or UNICEF. So they've got all this money. How can we get some money from them? But it's not always as straightforward as that. But really what we should be saying, in my opinion, is how do we become an implementing partner? How do we work together with an organization like Save the Children? Save the Children has got a lot of technical expertise, a lot of other strengths, and then some of us are on the ground, deeply on the ground, doing programs, and we can say, look, we're doing this, and you guys want to do this. How do we get together? So what advice would you give to someone who's working in Morocco, who sees there's a Save the Children office up the street, and it's like, hey, maybe I'll go and talk to them about partnering?
Well, exactly. I mean, you answered it there. I think we often think about ourselves in the NGO sector as in direct competition with each other for this pot of money. And it can't be like that. One organization is not able to respond to everything in society that people need, or that kind of needs to be responded to by an organization. It's just not possible. I think sometimes we really damage ourselves or our kind of potential by doing that. The best thing that we can be doing in the NGO sector is starting to collaborate more and more with each other, where Save the Children, as you said, really good child rights, technical. We might need access to clubs that have boys and girls after school where we can be imparting skills, whether it's through a kind of a digital literacy program, or where we can be working with a donor who says to us, look, we're really interested in working with you, but we want to be also working on coding, or we also want to be working on sporting. Instead of saying no to that funding opportunity, we could say, well, actually, we work with Boys and Girls Club, and they have a real need for coding or sports development. So how about we work together in a consortium and really start to collaborate? So I think, while you're mapping out who your potential funders are, and you're thinking about the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or Microsoft or whoever it might be, start to also think about who your potential collaboration partners could be. So whether those are partners who have a lot of funding and generally have kind of seem to be in the wings of, the UNICEF funding, those kinds of guys, but also start to think about who it is that could potentially help you to implement more programs, or who you could implement programs for. So don't just map out your partners thinking financially, map out your partners thinking strategy as well. Who can help you to develop and deliver these strategies?
Yeah, great, good. And I think this is another one that I want to talk about now is how, like, understanding your impact and communicating your impact to these potential partners, and saying, hey, I know I can do 1, 2, 3. I can't do 5, 6, or 7, but if you want someone to do this stuff, I certainly can. And then also leveraging those opportunities to tell a bigger story and find new opportunities as well. So I'd be also, aside from just the elevator pitch on a more bigger level, telling the bigger story, Reverend, what would you say are some important things to think about when communicating the impact that our organizations have on the ground to existing potential donors, or even just the community at large?
Well, I think, first of all, we can at least acknowledge our own strengths and what we bring to affect change. But at the same time, we can't do everything for everybody. And so I think as a result of that, if you're able to identify potential partners or strengths that could emerge from relationships. I just got back from Ghana just 2 weeks ago, and I had learned about the young man that really heads up the Boys and Girls Club initiative there in Ghana. And as a result of my talking with him, I put him in touch with, for example, the English teacher at the Weaver Primary School in Congo. And my goodness, he was so inspired by that conversation. Likewise, I put him in touch with the executive director of the Pan-African Empowerment in Rwanda. But it didn't end there. Because of our presence of the AME Church there in Ghana, I ended up having him to be in touch with the local pastors. And as a result of that, they're already looking at how they can relate and to build a relationship with one another. So I think it's about surveying, knowing what you're able to do, the human resources that you can be bringing to the table. But then there may be people like Stephen there in Ghana, who is just an extraordinary individual. And so I think that finding those kinds of relationships, again, I don't believe that they're by accident. It's divine how they emerge. And all that we need to do is to realize and to shake our heads and to say, that wasn't Jonathan Weaver, that was divine. But to recognize that if there was a divine moment before, it can happen again. So I think that it's terribly, terribly important to recognize the kind of synergy that can be created that can have greater impact than trying to do something all on our own.
Absolutely. I think, and this reminds me of an old saying, it's not fundraising, it's friend raising, right? It's making new relationships and starting new friendships with people. Di, I think we're going to close up in a minute. So I'd also be interested in getting your thoughts on how do you communicate, how do you measure the impact, communicate the impact in a thoughtful way without having a PhD thesis, doctoral thesis coming out, because we can write a lot of stuff and bore everyone to death.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think one of the most challenging things is communicating impact as it is impact, not reach, right?
Yeah,
And it's very specifically difficult doing this to a donor where you can reach 2 million children with a radio advert or, you know, with the delivery of gifts in kind, for example, right? You can reach these children. You can impact a child when you can see that that child's life has been completely changed, or has been impacted and kind of affected by your programs. Like what Reverend Weaver was saying before about needing to show that these children have graduated, right? And you've grown from having, I can't remember how many it was, a certain handful of children to having graduates in the hundreds, right? That's impact. You've completely irrevocably changed that child's life and the trajectory. Very difficult. It's also something to be careful of where they're not just numbers. You know, we've reached over 10 million children, or we've impacted over 10 million children's lives. To kind of follow that story up with how you've done that, and to kind of give the human face back to those figures is critical as well, because yes, a donor wants to know that their funding reached X many children, and they want to see the numbers at the end of the day. How you do that is, well, let's hear directly from them, right? So let's give them the opportunity to speak about how this program or how the funding has impacted their lives, because even if you only get one case story of them speaking, that's huge. That's them. It's a personal testimonial to how this funding has changed their lives. And I think that's really key as well.
Yeah, great. So we've got this last question, and then we're gonna throw over to the Q&A, the open questions. The question that I want to, or the topic I want to discuss now is, in our context, we often are hit by emergencies, crisis, natural disasters, war, whatnot. How do you, as a fundraiser or someone who wants to raise support for organizations in a time of urgent need or a crisis, Reverend, what would you say are some important things to be mindful of adapting your strategies and finding some support in a time of crisis or a time of emergency?
One of the things that I've observed over the years is that here in America, for example, only 7% of the American population has a passport. That means that, quite frankly, and when they turn on the television at night, they are rarely going to see anything about, for example, an African nation, unless there is some major humanitarian crisis. I try to make sure that as I travel around the United States, to make sure that I'm telling some good stories, to try to put things into some context, but also recognizing that even when they do see the humanitarian crisis that comes across the television, to recognize how blessed we are in America in comparison to what is happening to a lot of people in developing nations. So I try to make sure that I'm creating some kind of context. And because I've traveled quite a bit, so that when I go to whether or not it's a service organization or a church that's a part of my own denomination or elsewhere, at least many of them already know me because of my work and experience. So not that I expect to have them to consider me to be an expert, but again, they value my knowledge and my awareness of what is happening on the ground. And so therefore people are more responsive in the midst of a humanitarian crisis. The other thing, and I think that it was alluded to earlier, that for example, when the volcano erupted there in Goma several years ago, we did not try to do things in a vacuum. But in fact, we were able to also partner with 2 other locally based NGOs there, so that when I mentioned this to people here in America, there was a heightened level of legitimacy because I was able to acknowledge folks that are on the ground from other organizations with whom we were working. And again, as mentioned earlier, it was wonderful to be able to talk about what was generated as an impact in terms of the thousands of people that were benefited from the support that we were able to provide.
Great, excellent. Dianne, any thoughts on this?
Humanitarian funding is incredibly stressful, right? Just wanted to add that because you really are faced with, if this funding isn't coming through, what is the kind of direct result of that? And I think this kind of responding with urgency can be a little bit frightening, but I think it's really critical So I think one of the things I spoke about before was really mapping who your target audience would be in terms of funding, but then also in terms of strategic partners. One thing that what's really helped me is since 2020, since humanitarian response really became a reality for my work as well, was always when I'm looking at who these funders are, but who these potential strategic partners are, is who would be a good person to talk to about our humanitarian response, and just keeping that in mind always. And then also I think just maybe as a caution is even in humanitarian response is maintaining how we are talking about our beneficiaries and how we are talking about the experiences of people on the ground, and maintaining that legitimacy, but also really making sure that their dignity is still intact even in times of crisis.
Yeah,
Thanks.
absolutely. Great. So Abby, I believe, is going to share some follow-up questions with us.
We did receive a couple of questions in the chat. One person asked, some clubs don't necessarily have a strong social media or website presence. So how important is that to have before you start major fundraising efforts?
Great. I'll add my thoughts on this and then pass it off to the other guys if they have anything to add. I mean, I personally believe that you should open proper pages and proper accounts on at least the main social media channel that's in your country. It's a low cost, it's easy to do, and it does help you to get your message across. And you never know who's going to like you or start following you someday. It's quite surprising and quite a bit of an ego boost for the organization if suddenly you find even a minor celebrity has jumped on and has now become a supporter of your page. So I think it's extremely important to do that, but also to do it properly. Having a person profile that's called your organization is not the correct way to do it. Having a page is the correct way to do it. All you're going to do if you have a personal profile page is get banned when someone reports you, and then all of that effort and all the time that you've invested in that account is going to be lost. So I would say, with regards to communication, social media, for all its negative downsides, it's an easy one to get into. And at least if Facebook is your go-to in your home country, open Facebook. If it's Instagram, open Instagram. So that my thoughts are 100% crucial. You cannot measure the return that you're going to have on that, and it just takes one person to follow you to make some significant impact for your organization going forward. Dianne and Reverend, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Reverend, go for it.
Well, just very quickly, I know that, for example, where we do have a registered presence, meaning again in Rwanda, it was not a long time before our executive director recognized the importance of having a website, posting information about the programs that we have been engaged in there in Rwanda. And as a result of that, she's actually had some persons that have joined the work of the Pan-African Empowerment. And so it's terribly, terribly important for people to become aware of what you're doing. And so having that website has already proven to be a wonderful vehicle by which, and we have people not only there in the capital city of Kigali, but also in the westernmost city of Gasenyi that are involved largely as a result of having that website operational. So I want to commend her and the committee for making sure that that presence has been made. In terms of the future, certainly, Mike, we would want to be very sensitive and very careful about imaging, reputation for the organization, and be very, very careful about what is posted on our site. But at this point, I'm very encouraged by what has taken place.
Just to add to that as a final thought, having a social media presence and a website really offers your organization legitimacy. So, going out and talking about who you are as an organization, but you have really no kind of evidence, even if it is just a social, in Instagram, it can be really concerning. So I think just to add to both of you, it adds legitimacy to your organization for any kind of funder.
Yep, absolutely agreed. Abby, have you found any others that you think would be worth to add?
Yes, I think this will be our last question since we are coming up on the end of the hour. But we spoke quite a bit about fundraising within faith-based communities, and we know that there's certainly interest in that from many of the clubs that are within the World Federation of Youth Clubs network. So it's a two-part question. One is for how organizations who are not faith-based can get involved with church communities and other faith-based organizations. So it's really a question for Reverend Weaver, but a question for Mike and for Di would be how an organization can maintain their own neutrality and independence in working within their scope of work. So how do you balance working with faith-based communities? How do you partner meaningfully with church communities?
Well, if I could perhaps invert that question, Abby, and to say that obviously through the work of the Pan-African Collective and my involvement within the AME Church, but I recognize in the midst of that my role is not to engage in direct proselytizing. I'm involved and interested in developing young people and in so many ways. And so I have no qualms with, for example, what we're doing at the Weaver School, and even with the possibility of creating a chapter or two in Rwanda. Our goal is really, what can we do to create leaders for tomorrow in those nations and to reduce the amount of ethnic conflict. And so we've had no qualms about doing that, both in Rwanda and in Congo, connecting with organizations that may not be faith-based, but certainly value human development. So personally for us, it's worked well, and we've had success stories as a result of it.
I'll just add to that, absolutely. I really, I think that the kind of the barrier between is it shouldn't exist when you're really trying to reach participants to support them in the work that you're doing. When we enter into communities to implement programs, Save the Children, one of our key audiences and partners actually is faith-based organizations, because they have also, authority as well. When we're entering into a community, a faith-based organization, much like a youth-led organization, has existing networks within those communities. So how do we work together for the same goal?
Yeah, I think I just would like to add in closing on this. I think if you're a non-faith-based organization that's partnering with a faith-based organization and they want to push an agenda onto you, and vice versa, then that's not a real partnership. You're looking at a transaction that's trying to be taking place. So I would walk away from that. I think, any true believer or any true non-believer, it shouldn't be a deal breaker that you're going to work with someone on, for lack of a better word, the other side of the fence. We live in a diverse world with a lot of differences and a lot of different communities. We should be in our sector driving those connections and growing that community and growing those partnerships across all lines. If we really want to have a full equal world where people can find their full opportunity and truly flourish, we can only do that by having genuine partnerships across all the different faiths. So yeah, I think we sometimes have to leave our own personal baggage at the door. If we feel this is problematic, it might be that the way we're putting it across is actually the problem, that the person receiving the information doesn't have a problem. You're creating it through the way you're communicating. So I think, don't let that hold you back. Give it some thought before you go into those meetings or you go and connect with those people. And just remember, we all want to make a better world for the kids, for all the communities that we serve. That's fundamentally our mission. If you're talking to people that don't agree with that mission anyway, no matter who they are, then that's not really someone who you want to partner with anyway.
Wise words to close with. Thank you, Mike, Di, and Reverend Weaver for joining us today and for leading us through this fascinating discussion about navigating the world of fundraising. So again, thank you to all of our panelists and to our attendees for joining us today at the October webcast. You may have noticed there was a message in the chat just a couple of moments ago reminding you to register for the Promise Awards if you have not done so already. Please mark your calendars and register for our event on November 15th. That is a live virtual celebration of the programs, leaders, volunteers, staff members, and young people who are truly transforming their communities and their clubs. And we hope that you'll join us. You will receive a link to this recording once it is posted to YouTube, and we hope that you will continue to share this session with your clubs and with your networks because information like this is meant to be shared widely. So share the knowledge and your experiences here today. Please follow us on social media and reach out if you have any questions at all. World Federation of Youth Clubs is happy to help. Once again, thank you to our panelists, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.